Okay, hold on just a second.
Sure.
Hit the button, but it is not showing this recording. There we go. Now it's recording. Thank you, Tony.
All right, thanks. So this session is recorded. If you don't want to participate in that, then I guess you can drop off. Anyways, good morning. Found out that today is National Macaroni and Cheese Day. Would have thought that would have happened in the winter time. But anyways, July 14th, today we'll be offering water quality overview, nitrogen and phosphorus management concerns. So these three courses, like I mentioned a little bit ago, were offered at area meetings back in 2018. If you participated in that, sat in on one of those, you do not have to repeat today. You can possibly check that through AgLearn or some other way, but you don't have to participate, and it won't bother me if you drop off in the middle of this. So anyways, just make sure you realize that. My name is Tony Bailey. I'm State Conservation Agronomist at Indianapolis. Also with me today is Grace Moore, a student trainee soil conservationist, and she'll be helping moderate the chat and questions, and hopefully keeping us, especially me, on track, because I need lots of help. So happy that she's attempting to assist me. So with that, we'll get started. As I mentioned, this is a combination of 3 national AgLearn trainings. These courses, if you've looked at them at all in AgLearn, are national in scope. And so we've attempted to tweak them for us here in Indiana. We realize that not everyone is from Indiana, nor will you end your career here. So there are some national references that are included in here. And part of that's for some consistency. So we have consistent training across the country. But again, we did want to try and offer our piece to this and some things that we emphasize here in Indiana. So we'll go through these items here on the agenda. I think one of the toughest things for me to think about, even before we get into water quality, is thinking about some of the drivers, some of the things that are impacting our agricultural production, and some of the stressors that we have, the challenges that we have to produce more. And whether you look at the trends for population, realizing that not all of our crop production goes directly into food production, but looking at those population trends, how we utilize our land base, if we're building a bypass to the bypass around places like Kokomo or I-69, seems like all we have to do is add water, and we build subdivisions on some of our most productive lands. Those are all stressors on the system. How that production is utilized, what do we do with it? How much of it goes towards energy, whether it's ethanol or from soybean for soy diesel, all those different things, how that's being utilized. Throw in our varying extreme weather events, our challenges with climate, global warming, however you want to slice or dice that. It is creating additional challenges. How do we produce more? And then along with that, the nutrient availability and the production of those nutrients. And I think that part fits in here a little bit better related to the water quality. Another piece of this that I don't want us to forget about as we go through here is some of these perspectives, some of these, how we think about things. I'm never sure what makes a person tick, what appeals to anyone regarding conservation. We all come at this from different perspectives. The producers that we work with, think about your favorite commercial products. In many cases, there are multiple commercials to appeal to different audiences. And if you watch some of the same programs over and over again, you'll see different commercials there, and they're trying to appeal to different parts. So how do we think about all this? Is it someone that's how do they pull all this in? How do they access all this? And so one of those things I think about is some of the data, some of the information that Linda Prokopi has provided us related to social indicators, where producers get their information from, how they work with especially various vendors, certified crop advisors, seed dealers, and that, you know, and how they get their information from those folks. And then all these different things. And, you know, as we work with producers, and I'm sure you've had the same thing with them and landowners, what do you think appeals to this person? And hopefully through some of that good conservation planning, you'll get an idea of where that fits in. But one of those last ones there, and oftentimes it's one of the last things that comes into play, are regulations and or water quality. We do have a few producers that is a point of emphasis, but oftentimes that's not. So we use that as a little bit of a segue to transition to kind of get more into the course. So the beginning of this is talking about water quality for conservation planners. You know, think about this. It's a fundamental resource concern in conservation planning. You know, it's right up there with soil erosion and healthy soils and that, but it's need to think about it similarly. For me, I think it helps me to think about how the water moves across the landscape, whether it's runoff, carrying sediments into tiles, and all of that, where it ends up, how it ends up impacting us related to the Gulf of Mexico and or blue-green algae related to some of our reservoirs, or especially to Lake Erie. And we will dig into these more as we go along. But I also know, as much as I want to think about conservation planning and water quality and nutrients, how all this ties together, it's programs that drives us, and how we're working with our producers and related to those programs and what they're interested in. At the same time, keeping things like planning criteria and the various card assessments and all that in mind as we're working on this. I realize that there's more to this than just science aspects, but also how the conservation planning and that implementation happens. So realizing it is more than just talk about water quality. It's how it's implemented. So one thing that I think is kind of in the background of all this that we don't always think about, good or bad, is the Clean Water Act. So I'm seeing there's a question from the audience. What year was the Clean Water Act passed by Congress? Have any guesses out there? This is an actual question. Are we?
Have one 1976 and one 1960s.
All right, very close. Combine those.
1972 amended in 77.
Oh man, that's really good. Yeah, it was signed in 1972. Did a little bit of looking on that. It's kind of interesting because it overrode a veto by then President Nixon in 71, and it came in 72. So you know, to override a veto from the president takes pretty good bipartisan interest, both parties, to do that. So that's pretty good. All right, thanks, Trace. And what are the goals of that? Well, the other thing I think about is that is what happened at that time, late 60s, early 70s, and I realize some of you weren't quite born yet then, sadly. But anyways, there were actually rivers that caught on fire in the United States. You know, you think about that now, it's like, wow, how did that happen? Why do we let that happen? So we can thank Clean Water Act to try and address some of that. So what were some of the goals? Some of the goals were to have drinkable, fishable, and swimmable waters. Are we there on all that? No, we're not. We're doing better, but we're not quite there on that. There still is work to do. So I went through and looked at some of the various biological conditions across the country, and you know, about half of our streams and rivers are in some sort of poor condition, and so we know that you know, they need some more assistance. Here in Indiana, you know, at one time I used to think that sediment was the #1 water quality impairment, but I was told that E. coli is our number one, currently our #1 water quality impairment. So, you know, E. coli from animals, and a variety of ways that we get it from septics and livestock facilities, wildlife, all the above. So challenges that we have and attempts to address it. So we started thinking about water quality. I think it's important for us to think about the water cycle, the hydrology, where that precipitation comes from and how it interacts across the whole landscape. And hopefully this is very familiar for all of us. It's something we do every day. Where that water, you know, go out during a rainstorm and see where it's slowed or stopped or captured, and how it moves so intricately throughout the landscape. Whether it's overland flow and runoff, and most of us have seen these at different times. Of course, none of these pictures are taken in Indiana. All of them are from other states. And also how that water interacts as far as base flow, what are streams and creeks, you know, how that water moves laterally, not just vertically through the soil profile. And then we also have potential of that water being interrupted. As much as we are hoping for increased infiltration, we still need tile systems to have productive farmland, and but that is a point of interruption. So just because we get an extra inch or two of infiltration in the ground doesn't mean all of that goes to groundwater recharge. All right, so here's a opportunity for some classroom participation. What is the average amount of precipitation for Indiana? Average amount of precipitation for Indiana.
We've got 3 votes for 42. A lot of votes for 42 inches.
Oh man, it wasn't as tricky as I thought it was going to be. Okay, yep, that's right, 42. Well, that's very good though. That means you all have paid attention. So 42. Touch on this a little bit more as we go along. Of this precipitation, on average, about what percent evaporates, what percent runs off, and what percent is groundwater recharge? What percent evaporates, what runs off, and what percent is groundwater recharge? I bet this one's a little bit trickier than all of you get in the last one, right? Any votes out there, Grace?
They're kind of scattered. We have some for A, some for B, 1 for D, no C's.
Awesome, scattered. I like that. I think that's a sign of a better test question, maybe. You know what I would have thought about this also, I would have thought that it would have been closer to 50-50. And if I think about it, I want to go with A or B, but the correct answer is D. I'll show that here in a second. So this is a depiction, a picture out of a Indiana Water Resource book from 1980. Most of you might still have this on your shelf. It's a big, thick brown book that's there. Some of you might still have it next to the old blue FOTG folders. Anyways, a nice resource book. In there, it had this picture of the water budget. This is 1980. So then it was 38 inches of precipitation, about 26 inches of evaporation, 9 inches of runoff, and only 3 inches of groundwater recharge. 3 inches. So think about that drought back in 2012. irrigation pumps, removing water, pulling water out. Are we recharging those aquifers? I would think it might be a little tough that we're recharging those. So anyways, nice little picture. Think about those aquifers, those various water bodies, important for a variety of reasons. How that water moves, you know, again, we need it for other things, but where the water moves, it carries nutrients in that. Variety of different ways that we look at it. And then down here with the ditches and streams, you know, as that's going to be the last resort. You know, we don't have much chance when that water gets to those. At that point, we're just sending it down the Wabash, down the Ohio River to the Mississippi, and we don't have a chance of reusing it at all at any point later. We'd rather use it to fill our aquifers or to you know, recharge our ponds or lakes or reservoirs, especially as we see drought issues out west. Any chance we can get to hang on to that water is going to be beneficial to us. We start talking about this from a water quality standpoint. This is probably something we haven't emphasized much here recently. When I came on, I was working more directly with some watersheds, hydrologic unit areas. But this is something that's still out there. We still, I realize that some of the districts in that still work in this area, but something we haven't emphasized quite as much. But trying to think about the watersheds and the various non-point pollution sources and thinking about the whole overall picture of the watershed and where those sources are coming from. So we'll try and touch on that here a little bit more. Think about some of those critical source areas, and I'll throw out some terms here that some are used a little bit differently in other states or more frequently in other states, and some aren't used as much here in Indiana. So some of these might be new, some of these you've heard before, but this CSA, and just kind of talking about that overlap of that source of pollutant and how that pollutant is transported and where that overlaps is where that critical area is. So again, a small percent of the watershed fits into that. You kind of think about that. So talk about that a little more. Another way thinking about it, and this has been some work with Dr. Tomer and some others related to watershed assessment and targeting. I think this is interesting, intriguing. Wish I would have had it when I started. You know, some of this GIS capabilities to go through on a watershed, and with all the various tools that we have now, and trying to figure out where the most critical sites are. You can kind of picture them anyways. I mean, we could have guessed a lot of these, but just being able to put those out here in a different thought process, and then also where those, how it's the nutrient or how it's being lost across the watershed, and being able to target those then, and trying to figure out which practices might also fit there. So, but probably the first part of that is just trying to look at that whole picture. I like this thought process. It's a whole lot more fun than trying to tape maps and things together like I was doing when I started. So, but a good new way to look at this. Talked about this a little bit ago, but think about it in a really a much smaller watershed context. Small watershed in Pennsylvania. Very detailed analysis done on it. 90% of the phosphorus export comes from less than 20% of the watershed. So, you know, they identified lots of the areas low loss, some of the areas as medium there along the stream, and maybe those points up there to the left, those green areas closer to the barn, and then those other red areas, maybe high soil test phosphorus, or right at the mouth of the stream. So anyways, trying to identify those spots and to do something with them. Another thought of this is talking about this avoid, control, or trap. And this is something we've emphasized just lightly in Indiana. I think other states emphasize this a little bit more, but this ability of trying to avoid point, non-point source, those contributions from our operations and how we control them or how we trap them. And it's kind of funny, to me, there's been a little bit of overlap. There is overlap to me in these terms and how they're defined and think about them in the practices. So, but anyways, that's something used in other states. I like this approach a little bit better. Again, this is out of some work that Tomer did. This concept conservation planning toolbox. Probably one of the reasons I like it is because it fits some of my thought process, especially related to that foundation of that pyramid, improving or building soil health and doing everything that we can. And I think that's very true. Everything we can to have that, to build that base, and then we're just dealing with smaller portions of that, controlling the water within the fields, above that, controlling the water below the fields, and then the riparian management. So I think this picture depicts it pretty well. I think most of us have seen this and or participated in the Grace, still able to hear me okay, Grace?
It's still kind of breaking up a little, but I can hear you.
Okay. I just got something online, so I'll say it's okay now. This water filtration, very important. We're going to try to do what we can to get those raindrops to enter the ground where they land, infiltrate, and not move to other places. So hopefully we can have that happen. All right, I'm getting distracted. I keep seeing some bad network quality. Still able to hear me okay?
The slide you're still breaking up a little bit and your slide isn't fully loading.
All right, so hopefully, let me go back one. So we want to keep these things in mind. I mentioned the soil health earlier, how we want to use that to improve, maintain water quality, how that has so many connections to that. All this should be very familiar to us. Usually we think of it in a different way than water quality, but it all interacts and ties together. Change the slide a little bit. Achieving water quality takes a systems approach. Water quality is not a destination, so all these practices work better together. We need them to complement each other. Depending on the different loss mechanisms, we'll emphasize one over another, especially from a water quality standpoint. But just like with soil health, putting all these together does much more for us related to water quality than practices individually. So another piece of this is picking some of those practices for managing some of the runoff, for controlling that runoff. Trying to identify those areas in a watershed that are the most critical, and maybe even taking them out of production and putting them in some sort of conservation cover, putting them into CRP or something like that, can be real beneficial, especially if they're the lower producing spots in the field. Here we are applying the same amount of nutrients across the field, across the landscape, and we're getting less production. So we have, much higher potential for loss on those sites. And then also slowing concentrated flow, runoff, and sedimentation. Contour filter strips not used much here in Indiana, but obviously in other parts of the country. And then as a last chance, capturing sediment in a basin prior to it reaching a stream or a creek or river or lake. All right, another question. So what are our largest wascobs? The largest wascobs in the state of Indiana. Well, the state of Indiana or across the country. Water and sediment control basins. Is it a project designed in southwest part of the state? Is it I would offer that some of our largest wascobs, unfortunately, are our lakes and reservoirs. Think about any of the reservoirs in the Northeast, you know, Lake Schaefer, Lake Freeman. I worked in Monticello for a while. I called Lake Schaefer one of Indiana's largest wascobs. I didn't do it very often in meetings, but as it was filling with sediment, it was causing impairments for lake uses and things like that. That was a real factor. Look at Monroe or Patoka in the south also, and as these fill with sediment, even things like Lake Erie, when we fill those with sediment, it reduces water capacity and the depth. But as a reminder, that shallower water then warms up faster, and warmer water impacts the algal growth, maybe leading to harmful algal blooms. So again, by doing what we can, and the great job that we've done to reduce the amount of sediment that makes it in these, just because we put a plug on a river, stream, or now we're collecting all that sediment and have higher potential for the water to warm up and cause algal blooms. So I think something to kind of think about there as we work on those. Another piece of this related to hydrology, how the water moves through the landscape, trying to think about what the water, before the water enters the tile, replacing these low spots, some are natural, well, a lot of natural spots, maybe sometimes are wascobs. And then what I say, either taking the tillage-induced wetland. Tillage-induced wetland is not an official USDA wetland designation. Something I observed while working in White County. But a lack of water infiltration due to soil crusting and compaction and runoff from other parts of the field, taking some of those spots out of production and replacing them with something like this, a blind inlet. So there are ways to attempt to address some of these, and we want to do that if possible. Another thing is, as we think about that drainage, we know that it also contributes to some water quality challenges, but we want to try and get rid of that water as fast as possible. But drainage water management has potential to assist us with some of that. So the ability to hold some of that water back in the field, and you know, at times like this now, when although parts of the state are pretty wet right now, but anyways, more often than not, here in July and August, we'd like to be able to hold some of this water back for crop production if possible, but then being able to release it later in the year. But when we're able to hold some of this up after we've applied nutrients or that, we're able to keep it out of our waterways. Also, being able to use denitrifying bioreactors and things like that can also assist with those. Another piece of this is thinking about some of the last attempts, edge of field, how we control or treat some of that. Constructing wetlands, still not a very popular subject. Some states, Illinois and other places out west, have had a little more success with this. I think they've also marketed them a little bit differently. There's some other hunting and things that go on some of these spots, so they're able to take some areas out of production. Maybe they weren't the most productive anyways, and construct wetlands on them and hold some water back, or designing a nutrient interception wetland, especially for hot spots in a watershed or fields. Or so just trying to think about how we address some of those. And then the final place that we might be able to impact some of this is with a two-stage ditch. Some of these gone in central, northern parts of the state. has some interesting potential for water treatment. The shadow ditch in Kosciuszko County, coupled with cover crops, seem to be very effective at reducing nutrient loads out of that ditch. Had great participation from interaction and participation from the landowners, the producers there, and was able to address a lot of issues there. But some of the last ditch efforts there to try and treat the water as possible. All right, so that's what I had for the overview. Do we have any other questions or anything, Grace, that have come in?
It doesn't look like there's any coming in right now. There was one at the very beginning, if there was a list of participants who had already taken this training.
A list of participants. I'm sorry, I don't think we had that. It would have been very similar to the FOTG list. I did not go back and look at this. Again, it should have shown up in your Ag Learn. These should already be recorded as done, but I don't have that. All right. So if there are no questions, let's take about a 5-minute break. So we'll start up again at 10:08. But a chance to grab coffee or whatever else you need to do. Thank you. All right, so we'll get started up here real quickly. Any other questions coming, Grace?
No.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so well, first was getting started. One of the things that I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm kind of tired of meetings and Zoom meetings and, well, meetings in general, but Zoom meetings and Teams meetings and whatever, ready to do some things live. It's, as nervous or apprehensive as it is, making presentations to people, at least you can see some interaction, you get a few head nods, whatever else. But, as a presenter, just sitting here at my dining room table, looking out my window, I got nothing. So, but anyways, I think we're all ready to get back for some of this. But I also will acknowledge that this means I don't have to drive across the state and make presentations at 4 different meetings. So so that part is beneficial. So anyways, so let's get started on nitrogen and phosphorus. I start thinking about these. It's really tough to split these two apart. There's lots of overlap. At the same time, they both behave a little differently in the environment, and our conservation practices to address them differ as well. It's also important to realize and think about how and when we address one resource concern, it might not have a large positive impact on another resource concern. So one example of this might be if we're going to incorporate manure. While it reduces the volatilization of N and gets phosphorus in contact with the soil, there's also an increased potential for erosion. So I think we're aware of that. At the same time, makes it a little tricky as we're trying to think about sedimentation or nitrogen or phosphorus. What's the major contributor, and how do we address the biggest issue first, and then hopefully we're making some incremental tweaks or changes on the rest of the system as we work along. So with nitrogen, it's a critical plant nutrient along with phosphorus and potassium. And we know that nitrogen on its own without the other two won't work as well. Any of the soil fertility experiments ever did any in lab, trying to grow crops and only using one nutrient or the other, it doesn't work as well. We combine them together, we get better results. At the same time, nitrogen fertilizer is usually the most important nutrient input required to produce crops, especially for our corn crops. Obviously not for soybeans, but needed for corn. Think about potential loss mechanisms, how it might be lost in the environment, and potential risk of leaching. Nitrates down into the groundwater. Various parts of the country, sandy soils and that obviously have more potential. Even for Indiana, northern part of the state has more challenges, more issues than the rest. But that's one of the loss mechanisms we think about. And then that nitrate in the groundwater, the concerns, potentially reaching those safe water drinking limits and causing issues with infants or unfortunately with livestock as well. So having to pay attention and monitor for those, and testing our wells and things like that, and making sure that we aren't above those safe drinking water limits. Also think about nitrogen in surface water, and nationally, 40% of the streams are in poor shape, and then looking here across the Midwest, and it's higher than that. And it varies a little bit across the country, obviously, with land use and climate and other things like that, all drivers with that. And then also nitrogen contributes to eutrophication in our streams, lakes, and reservoirs. helps to, cause those problems and degradations related to those. And is also a major contributor to the hypoxic zones scattered on our coastal waters. We hear about the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, but yet we have other hypoxic zones scattered all across the coastal areas. So I don't always think about or remember that as well. So we think about the nitrogen and what those the different sources are, how we're going to utilize them either with the crops, how they interact in the landscape, and all that. A lot of our inputs are still from commercial fertilizers. We still apply commercial fertilizers to most of our, especially our corn crop. Trying to do better with manure and biosolids, trying to get manure spread on more acres, trying to take more credit for it, trying to utilize it better. I think we're doing a little better with that, but still work to do. How we utilize compost, there's potential there to use that, residues, cover crops and green manures. We know we're still struggling a little bit with how much credit to take with that. Is it a person early in the process using cover crops? Maybe we don't take as much credit, but we know some of our more advanced soil health farmers are taking lots of credit for the cover crops, either as producers of nitrogen or scavengers of nitrogen, and they feel much more comfortable. And I think there's more potential on a more mature conservation cropping system, a soil health management system that we can take more credit for that. But I always love the debate on how much credit we should take. It's kind of like with manure. I look at nutrient management plans and I get a plan in and it says they gave 0 credit for the manure, nitrogen manure supply. That's wrong. We can argue whether it was 5 pounds or 180 pounds, and that would be a great debate on the timing and when it was applied, and if it was incorporated, if it was left on the surface, and all that. But we should be taking some credit for it. And then also, if we're able to fix some from the legumes, and in some cases across the state, irrigation water we'll need to pay attention to. I know down in south central part of the state, there was some irrigation water that had some nitrates in it that, as we're applying it across the crop, in July and August, we're kind of spoon feeding a little bit of nitrogen there. So just trying to keep that in mind in the whole nutrient budget. But those are some different sources of nitrogen that we're utilizing. A variety of fertilizers, like I mentioned, a lot of different forms of that. So then also forms of nitrogen. Nitrogen cycle, we'll spend about the next, 10, 20 minutes on the nitrogen cycle. No, I'm kidding. We'll just spend a little bit on it. Hopefully you're all aware that nitrate and ammonium are the forms most needed, most utilized by the plant, taken up by the plant. One of the challenges with the nitrate is that as needed, one of the forms needed by the plant, it's also one of the forms most readily lost, especially through leaching. So, but one of the things wants to think about on this nitrogen cycle, and something that's kind of forgotten about, is how much biology drives the cycle. And so all the transformations that are going on and the decomposers and the movements of different forms of nitrogen and the impacts of water and everything on it, but the degree that biology plays a role is important. So hopefully as we improve, have healthier soils, as we add more biology to it, hopefully we have more ways to transform that nitrogen, those nutrients, and make them available to the crop, capture them, so they're also not lost to the environment. Mentioned a little bit about that nitrification part of it. The mineralization, that breakdown of organic N and release of plant available ammonium N. The immobilization, we'd like to have, it's kind of a challenge. Some of this nitrogen is going to become unavailable to plants, is going to get bound up. but it's also going to be eventually released again as we get more biology into the soil. I think it was kind of improving soil organic matter, and we have to have biology to do that, but then biology is going to release some of that as well. Hopefully spoon feed that to the crop throughout the process. That's what always happened in the prairies. We think some of that's going to happen in our cropland as well. Next time we've seen this around. So what we want to do is pay attention to the loss mechanisms here, the orange boxes, volatilization, denitrification, and leaching. We already talked a little bit about that. When that nitrate is taken up by the crop, it also becomes available to leaching, especially in sandy soils left too long. So it's one of those things. The longer that is sitting there, the more days that it has to interact and not be taken up by a crop, the more likely it is to be lost. So we're always trying to impact, trying to reduce those loss mechanisms, trying to make more of it available to the crop. And so with that, we kind of, the way I think about it is, what is the nitrogen fertilizer efficiency? What is the nutrient use efficiency of the amount of nutrient that is available to the crop or applied to the crop? What percent of that fertilizer is taken up by the corn crop? And so about 60% of the fertilizer is accumulated by the corn crop. Where does the rest of it go? Well, we know some of it's immobilized, building that soil organic matter, some of it's some of the various loss mechanisms. But we also know that we can do better with that. We have some of the soil health farmers, and so let me back up here a second. We used to apply about 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of corn. That was kind of a rule of thumb that was used long ago. Then it dropped closer to a pound per bushel. I hear some of our top soil health farmers mention 0.6 to 0.8 pounds per bushel. So they have optimized their nutrient use efficiency. They need less nitrogen in their system. But it's one of those things to remember, that their system has been optimized. We've got better water infiltration, we've got more biology, we've got just everything else has been ramped up. So when all those other factors those other components have been improved, we need less nitrogen fertilizer, which is a really interesting thing to think about. I mean, from a water quality standpoint, from a production standpoint, from energy production standpoint, just all across the board. So all of that is, it's always intriguing to me when I hear those soil health farmers talk about how little nitrogen. And I'll also hear from researchers, some of the campus researchers, their concern is, well, what if they applied more? Are they limiting their crop yields? And I think in a lot of cases we know that they're probably not, but we always kind of wonder about that. If they had a few other strips out there and they put on a little bit more nitrogen in a few places, would they be able to tell that for sure? But it's always tough from year to year, and when that nitrogen applied and how it was if it was spoon fed or not. And how that's done, but trying to do what we can to improve that nutrient use efficiency. So another piece related to environment, nitrogen, is having some of that assessment evaluation. We have a nitrate leaching index available to us. Has soil leaching and runoff factors, look at things like climate and soil properties, water table. So we have that's just kind of on the inherent site characteristics, the soils there. Obviously, field management can impact that. So trying to do the things that we can to improve and slow those loss mechanisms again. Thinking about those pieces to avoid nutrient loss, control nutrient loss, and trap nutrients in sediments are related to nitrogen. So just trying to focus on some of those here for a little bit. So practices to avoid nitrogen loss. What are the 4 R's of nutrient management? What are the 4 R's of nutrient management? And this is a class question. the right blank, the right blank, the right blank, the right blank.
We have an answer, right place, right rate, right time, right source.
Awesome, man. This is great. Yeah, that's right. So one of the things I think that's also helped us a little bit is this piece has also been promoted from the Fertilizer Institute. So, you know, it's one of those things being pushed to fertilizer dealers, certified crop advisors, and trying to think about all this. It helps when we have industry along with us. And it's interesting because I've been working with 590 or nutrient management standards since 2001 or so. And we've had these four items in there in our definition since the beginning. So it's really nice that that piece hasn't changed. Like I said, it's when industry came along and also started to promote this, you know, that continuity of message, very beneficial. We can also think about how these nutrients are applied, the right, trying to figure all these things out, the right rate in that. Tri-state fertilizer recommendations, you know, completed about 1998, updated last year. Still need to get some of those, some of that information out to you, but just kind of been updated here recently. They refer to the agronomic and or the economic nitrogen rates, a little bit different related to those. One thing I don't see in there is an environmental nitrogen rate. Kind of interesting that we have agronomic and economic. The other part of it is, like I've already mentioned, is improving the nutrient use efficiency. Doing everything we can to get more of that nutrient within the crop. So here's a slide that I think is interesting, but it's a little busy, a little bit going on. So one of the things I want to think about is where are we at right now? We're here in July. You know, the corn is at some of its maximum nitrogen uptake. This big green blob over here. What we'd like to do, we would have liked to have had happen is the nitrogen applied as close as possible to uptake. So that would be side dress. Or I guess we could actually have some wide drops or something going down through the row right now. A little bit newer technology, but something some people are looking at. Side dress, you know, something back here in May or June, more likely June. Pretty good timing, pretty good way to get it on. We also think about this a little bit. We've got this going across the top there of cover and no cover. So if we make a nitrogen application back in November and there's no cover there, that's the poorest time of year to apply our nitrogen, highest potential for loss. At the same time, then, if we had a cover crop, hopefully we are capturing some of that and keeping that in play for later. No growth over the winter time, and then whether nitrogen is applied back in the there in the spring, or just that the cover can also uptake it then. And if it's taking it up, then it can potentially release it for later. But if there's no cover there, then we have higher potential for losses. Hopefully they're doing things of using nitrification inhibitors, urease inhibitors, things like that. And that's frequently done, especially back in the fall, early winter, but still all those biological processes, time, weather, how much rainfall we get, how warm it's been. If we get some warm stretches and it's wet, you know, we have higher potential for losses. Just trying to think about this and trying to get as much applied as possible later. The other part of the thought is, the hope is that if we have a cover crop out there, as that cover crop decays, breaks down, whether we terminated it with herbicide or for green, rolled it down, you know, that'll slowly release and become available later to the crop. So it's just an interesting way of thinking about or looking at this. Another thing is looking at those practices to avoid nitrogen losses. We can do what we can to change the crop rotation a little bit. Bit of a challenge here. You know, we yesterday in the tillage transect discussion, we talked about living covers. You know, trying to do what we can to get some more small grains out there, some more wheat. And some of these crops don't require quite as much nitrogen as our corn, especially if we're going corn rotations. Do what we can with irrigation management. Cover crops just come into play in this in numerous ways of avoiding and capturing and treating. But whenever I think about the 4 R's, one of my concerns is that, and as great of a starting point as it is, it forgets about some of the environmental issues with it. So I kind of like the 4 R's plus the E. Now it's always tough to sell that E part because you know, it's not thought of as highly and maybe not, you know, not promoted with that. But trying to we can to control the erosion, that runoff, setback requirements, especially for applying manure, buffers. You know, we put out these filter strips and that. And we get these zones of no application. You know, if we used to farm right up to the edge of the stream or ditch, right up to the edge, a planter going off into the side of the stream or the ditch. And now we no longer apply nutrients there because we're not cropping up to the edge. We have less potential of that to be lost. So if we've got a 30 or 60 foot buffer there, we have some real potential, not just from the trapping aspect of it or control, but now we're not applying it right there. We're avoiding applications to those spots. So a couple other practices, all familiar to us, and one I want to emphasize a little bit here is strip till, one that we I think forget about a little bit. There's probably a few places in the state. I think about Lake Erie Basin, parts across the central areas of the central part of the state, and lots of other counties as well. That strip till could fit in. I know there's still some hesitancy with no-till, but you know, getting that nitrogen below the soil surface, you know, especially on some of these flatter soils, has some real interesting potential, and it would get us a lot of the same benefits, soil health benefits as no-till. Don't get me wrong, I think we like to move towards no-till, and when we do the strip till, we want to do that as the least amount of working the soil as possible, but there's other ways of utilizing that. Also around our livestock operations, confinement operations, still lots of challenges with the nutrients that are there. How do we hold on to those nutrients and reduce the nitrogen loss? Storing below the pits, the waste storage, the treatment, the recycling. You know, when we're confined like this, we're not as concerned about some of the runoff issues, but you know, even some of these confinement buildings, you know, the fans can still blow materials up on the roofs or outside, and so hopefully they're doing some good housekeeping stuff and cleaning up around the roofs. And I know they've done some testing over the years, and if they had gutters on there, they can find some pretty hot nitrate sources right there coming off the facilities. So just trying to remember those across the landscape as well. And then those various practices to trap the nitrogen, already touched on filter strips, but you know, taking some of these areas least productive out of production, and putting other practices there and making sure that we're utilizing them. When we have tile in the landscape across a lot of the state, how do we utilize that? Take advantage of drainage water management as we're putting in new tile systems. Are we thinking about where those structures might go for drainage water management? Hopefully that is happening. Whether they're being put in now or not, hopefully that thought process is there for for the tile contractors and the farmers. I still think about one of the best things is identifying the low producing areas of a field, trying to take those least productive out of agricultural production, putting them into conservation cover, CRP, pollinators, monarchs, some other wildlife planting. There's lots of different things, plant them back to trees. But there's a variety of different ways to attempt to address these, along with some of the other conservation practices that we're all familiar with. Again, thinking about the water quality, I still will emphasize that strip till piece. And on all these, how this system fits together, how we take credit for the cover crops, how we adapt nutrient management applications. Early on in a system, we might not reduce the rates of nitrogen that are applied, but hopefully years 3 to 5 or 7 or something, we can start reducing some of those nutrient inputs, the nitrogen. We start seeing some real benefits of how this all works together. And then the benefits of how they all relate together, Dr. Klidivko looked at down there at CPAC. When you put the cover crop in, was able to show that the annual nitrate, and with the system, annual nitrate concentrations in tile water dropped from over 30 parts per million to under 10 parts per million. So quite a reduction there. Again, benefits of that system and how it works together. So a conclusion on this this piece here on nitrogen. We know nitrogen is a critical plant macronutrient. Nitrogen fertilizer is the most important input required for most crops. Plants take up 2 forms of nitrogen, the nitrate and the ammonium. Keeping those various loss mechanisms in mind. Always trying to do what we can to reduce those, trying to probably reduce the one that has the most impact first. This other piece in here about climate is going to continue to impact us as we have other weather events and things like that. Extreme weather events are just going to continue to cause stressors to us. So do what we can with proper nitrogen management to meet those crop needs. We still need the crop production while also reducing impacts on water quality and do what we can in conservation planning and implementation to reduce those losses and those water quality impacts. All right. Grace, have any questions come in?
None right now.
All right. So let's take another 5-minute break. We'll start back up at 10:41. 10:41. Thank you. All right, so I have 10:41. We'll go ahead and get started back up. Grace, I should have asked this at the very, very beginning. You're only able to see my presentation slides, correct?
Correct.
Awesome. Okay, so let's get started on phosphorus. It's also an important plant macronutrient along with nitrogen and potassium. We know that all these work better together. Rarely do I see a case where a field where it is phosphorus deficiency. You know, we'll see cases where the plants are purpled, especially in the spring, showing apparent deficiency, but sometimes we actually now get to wonder if that has to do with the rooting or if it's just wet, has wet feet or something like that, but not necessarily that there is phosphorus deficiency. So, but anyways, often applied as an orthophosphate, product of rock phosphate, or as a component of manure. And then large quantities were applied in some areas of the country. So as we've gotten into more crop production, more we've had some other challenges with that. But today's phosphorus cycle is fragmented, and this is a piece that I think is kind of important to think about. We have a lot of the grain production here in the Midwest. Obviously, we have livestock facilities here, so we're not shipping that that grain very far. But there is a lot of grain that is exported out of the Midwest to Delmarva, or oddly, we built livestock farms in out west. I understand some of the reasons, but anyway, so we move that grain out there, and then they produce manure. And then what do we do with it? They don't grow as much as the crops out there, and then so what do we do with that manure? A little tougher to haul that manure back. So usually what we do is we rely on phosphorus that is mined and processed. It's in Florida, Morocco, or in Morocco, and it's Morocco, the country, not Morocco, Indiana. It's a lot of it is processed there in around the Gulf. You've heard about some of the water quality issues related in Florida, some of the great big lagoons they have there. Every time there's huge rainfalls or a tropical storm now, I hear about potential of those being released. I think there was one that did release some into a bay around Tampa or something. Or it's processed in Louisiana. We ship it, put it on a barge, move it up the Mississippi, move it up the Ohio River, put it on rail cars, move it on semis to our fertilizer dealers. They put it on trucks, take it out on buggies, and spread it across our crop fields. How many miles has that phosphorus had to move to get to our crop fields? And the process of this that just really stymies me is then we work with livestock producers who can't haul manure one field further away. And yet somehow in our thought process, it's okay to move phosphorus thousands of miles. I'm sorry, I'm shaking my head. So this is one of those things that I think we've got, I think we're doing a better job of it, helping to move that phosphorus further away from the buildings, out to the fields where it's needed, trying to take better credit for it. That manure has such value. It's a byproduct, but it is here already. How do we get more of that applied to other fields? Less of it on top of the fields, building up that soil test phosphorus. I think we've got some potential there with some of our farms either getting started or that have been in a soil health management system, conservation cropping system for a long time, and they're looking for something different, a boost. And we have seen some producers doing that now with manure. Wasn't last year because we didn't do anything last year as far as going to meetings or not. We went to the North American Manure Expo up at Fair Oaks. Must have been back in 2019. Ran into a farmer there from Ontario. After I made a presentation, and he came up and told me that he was trying to diversify the manure that was applied to his crops. So not only was he diversifying his cover crops and his crops, his thought process was also to diversify the types of manure. So one year would get cattle, another year would get poultry, another year would get swine manure. I was like, wow, that's awesome. You know, that's really really moving the thought bubble there. So I was really intrigued by that. So anyways, I think there's some other places that could be utilized, try and get manure across the landscape, somewhat of soil health management system. So anyhow, this is a fragmented, this is broken. So I still think there's lots of potential of things we can do with this. Hopefully we can continue to make some progress on it. As we've, applied the nutrients, it is interesting that, so possibly at one time, in the 60s, maybe lack of phosphorus was an issue, was a nutrient deficiency issue on some of our crops. For whatever reasons, now we're doing a much better job. We have higher soil tests, and it's not as likely to be an issue. So, sorry, I don't have a later slide, but I would. If anything, I think it's come down a little bit, but I think we're still some of those same levels. As we've applied more of that phosphorus, as we have more phosphorus available, then we also have more of it in the surface water. So again, that national, some nearly 50% of waters are impacted by phosphorus. Here across the Midwest, it's similar. We'll talk a little bit more about how that phosphorus impacts some of our streams in that. So question for the audience, which is the limiting nutrient for plant and algal growth in fresh waters? All right, this is a gimme. Which is the limiting nutrient for plant and algal growth in fresh waters? All right, I'll listen to the answer first. It's phosphorus. I won't even wait on Grace to get people for this one. All right, but the next one, class participation on this one. Which nutrient appears to contribute the most is the driver for harmful algal blooms, HABs? And I think about specifically with Lake Erie. Which nutrient is the driver for harmful algal blooms? Phosphorus, sulfur, calcium, or nitrogen?
It looks like they're split between phosphorus and nitrogen.
Okay. Yep, I could see that. So again, phosphorus is a contributing factor to that, but what some of the research is pointing at now is that nitrogen is one of the drivers for the harmful algal blooms. I still think that temperature is right in there too, but they're talking about nitrogen, and of course climate and how much rainfall we've had and when we've had it, and that I think I think I missed it here at the end of June. Maybe NOAA or somebody put out, NOAA the scientific, not the biblical person, put out their forecast for harmful algal blooms for Lake Erie. So we started thinking about phosphorus in the environment at one time. We really didn't think about it as being much of an issue. The runoff carrying sediment and nutrients were causing the concerns with the environment. But the N and elevated water temperatures and climate change also impact it. But the thing that I think about with this and phosphorus is, do you know where you were at during the Toledo water crisis in 2014? And I know I've asked this question a little bit for some. Very impactful. It wasn't impactful for many of us here in Indiana, but obviously for someone growing up living in Toledo, not only could the 500,000 people there not drink the water, but they also weren't even supposed to come into contact with it. So if you remember, they had the National Guard come out and distribute water, and that's pretty impactful. I remember at the time we were on vacation, we were driving across Iowa. I wasn't driving at the time. Wife was driving, and I was looking at at news and I saw that this had happened in Toledo, and I was like, oh no, that's really bad for all of them. But I also thought, oh no, this is a game changer for us, for agriculture. And it has been impactful for us. You know, the state of Ohio has passed numerous laws and things related to that. And so anyways, you know, just lots of things to think about in relation to that. So talk a little bit about the phosphorus cycle. We'll just touch on this a little bit like we did on the nitrogen cycle. So yeah, the various forms that phosphorus are in the soil, how it's tied up, if it's tied up with aluminums and irons and that, more tightly held, how it's moved, how it's released, again, biological processes in different forms that are taken up by the crops. But these red ones are the losses or removals. Hopefully we're removing a higher percentage of it with crops. Some of it is lost as runoff and erosion. At one time we thought that's how it was all done. And then also with the a little bit lost with the leaching. We'll touch on all of these a little bit as we go along here. So this piece on how phosphorus moves across the landscape. long ago, back when I was in school, you know, we didn't really talk about other forms of phosphorus being lost as a dissolved portion. Now, I won't say it wasn't talked about. I won't say I was, maybe I missed it that day in class, or I wasn't paying attention. That's always very possible. But, you know, mostly in almost all cases, if we controlled erosion and sediment loss, we took care of phosphorus. And we did a very good job with that. And we did a good job with that in Lake Erie. And we reduced sedimentation and losses through that. But what we've discovered now is that these other dissolved forms of phosphorus, we need to pay attention to things like total phosphorus, total dissolved phosphorus, soluble reactive orthophosphate, that those pieces are more quickly available for plant and algae uptake. And you know, we want it for plant uptake in crops, sure, obviously, but unfortunately, it's also lost through algae. So it's unfortunately, you know, the runoff in that, and we'll continue to touch on that as we go along here. So I think about these phosphorus basics. You know, one of the best ways is to measure it, and that's through soil testing. Hopefully, we're doing a good job of collecting those. You know, whether we're doing it with whole fields or grids or management zones, or how we're doing it, we're pulling enough cores, sending enough to the lab. Lab has several different ways they can look at it, several tests that they can do, but usually those results are only as good as the sampling that's done and how it's submitted and you know, taken care of in the field or at the lab. Then out in the field, there are yield responses to soil test phosphorus. Obviously, if the soil test is very low, applying you know, phosphorus, we would expect to get some yield response. When we get up to these medium and optimum levels and higher, there's not as much phosphorus that's needed, and we can really pull back on that. So we're trying to do a little bit better job with that. This here is phosphorus recommendations for corn. This is from the old Tri-State. Sorry, I didn't update this. From the old Tri-State fertilizer recs. So one of the things that we've done is this 40 parts per million as this cutoff down here. We'll probably even move a little bit lower, that you know, we don't need as much phosphorus as what we thought we did. So we'll see some of that lower as we go through. And then we also used to think of phosphorus and how it's applied. You know, if we're in a buildup or in a maintenance, we're trying to use this red line more and not even use this drawdown range. Again, this needs to be updated a little bit, but be more in this buildup and maintenance range. So this thought process has changed a little bit too. Another piece related to this with phosphorus is about the time of the 590 was being worked on, updated in the early 2000s, there was a thought process that we should have something called a phosphorus index, a PI. And that was put together, and then even a subsequent national policy has really forced states to include this. Fortunately, in Indiana, we had already included some of this back in 2001. But that time, they gave us several different options of how we could look at that. We could have, based on soil test, based on removal, or phosphorus index. Kind of thought this phosphorus index was a way to do it, but again, we've been a little bit challenged with these field scale assessment tools. Being able to GIS. We just haven't made that little quantum leap there. I think the process is there. We just haven't taken it to that yet. So just trying to look at the two things there: the availability of the phosphorus and soil fertility, and the phosphorus that's applied, and then also look at the loss mechanisms. A question? And then also, so then different states looked at different factors. So here in Indiana, we looked at the with our assessment tool. It evaluates the inherent site and soil characteristics, and then it also addresses those components with the high loss potential, and then trying to figure out which management activities or conservation practices can be used. And then we included that within the Purdue's manure management planner. So hopefully someone developing a nutrient management plan has that included. So the components that we looked at were soil erosion, water and wind, what was the inherent potential there, surface runoff class, nitrate leach index, subsurface drainage potential, flooding frequency, soil test phosphorus, and the distance to water body. And so, we went a little bit beyond the phosphorus index, so we included that nitrate leach index portion of it. We wanted to look at more from a conservation planning standpoint, so that's why it's just looked at it as a off-site risk index or nutrient and sediment transportation risk assessment tool. We've had a couple different name changes on that, so looking at those components. And so one of the biggest things on here is if we had any individual component that was in the high or very high, we wanted to make sure that was addressed. Some of the early forms of the phosphorus index had an additive, a cumulative process for doing this. They wanted to look at all the factors, and then if you added them up, you got over a certain number, then you had to do something. And one of the big concerns was, well, if you had erosion out there, shouldn't we be addressing that? Because you could have, high erosion potential and low soil test phosphorus, and you could come back and say, well, you didn't need to do anything. And we thought we should be attempting to address those. So that was our thought process, trying to address those. So a question from the audience. Thanks, appreciate it. What difference does soil test make on phosphorus losses? Great question, great question. So the soil test does make a difference. In most cases, if we are 50 parts per million or so below soil test phosphorus, little of that is lost. I mean, there's still potential. If we have heavy erosion, we can still lose some, but especially from the dissolved reactive phosphorus portion of it. But as we incrementally start to increase, we have higher potential for loss. And so one of the things that we did is develop this chart, and then we got to this portion of the 200 parts per million. Didn't want any more phosphorus applied, and this had to do specifically with organic nutrient application guidelines. Fertilizer would still be at that 40, 50 parts per million. We're in the process of updating the 590 now, and I anticipate these numbers will go lower. I should anticipate. I know these numbers will go lower. So we'll wait and see how that shakes out. This other piece, you know, think about the soil test phosphorus. You know, a livestock facility here on the north side, top of the map. You know, where are the highest soil tests at? Well, they're usually closest to the storage facility. Have this bullseye effect that Dr. Brad Jordan used to talk a lot about. And then as you get further and further away from the facility, you have less of an issue. At the same time, kind of we talked about that fragmented piece of the phosphorus puzzle. You know, if we already have nutrients here, already have phosphorus here, how do we get manure moved from the storage facility to fields further away? And how do we, you know, haul the hottest manure, the highest value, further away? So there's other things that can be done here, and hopefully we're thinking about and we're doing. Talked about this a little bit ago. You know, using the phosphorus index, which accounts for soil P and their applications. You know, here again, a small percent of the watershed contributes the largest portion of the phosphorus export. So trying to identify those places, do something different with them, maybe take them out of production, don't apply nutrients there anymore, control the erosion, whatever the case might be. So trying to target those. We used to think of those phosphorus loss mechanisms, and you know, a lot of it, well, whether it's loss or removals, again, crop removal, hopefully we're taking it off as within the crop. Some portion is being lost as topsoil or runoff, but especially the leaching and runoff. When we have very high soil test levels, greater than 100 parts per million, and the pH is optimum. We also have higher potential for losing it. But those phosphorus losses of greatest concern lately is that soluble P at the surface, whether it's crop residues, you know, as much as we want to leave crop residues on the surface, and we do, they still leak some nutrients out of them. I think we're doing a better job if we keep all that residue on the field rather than allowing that residue to float off of the field and end up in a ditch or a stream. So, you know, we want to anchor it there with cover crops or, you know, something else. We don't want to chop and splice and dice it so it moves off of those fields. Then also the manure and applied fertilizer. So we want to try and keep all those on the site. But when you combine those with various runoff potentials, macropores, cracks, risers, tile basins, you know, with all the tile risers that we have scattered across the state, especially northern part of the state, is it truly tile water or is it surface water? I think in a lot of cases we have, you know, surface water that's not able to infiltrate. It's not able to make it down through the soil profile to the tile. So that water moves across the surface, goes to a tile riser, and then comes out in the tile. We also have this issue, this picture down here in the bottom, blowhole or suck hole. You know, each one of these, if you take a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, is about a ton of soil. You know, I mean, obviously it's a point where water can infiltrate, but it's also soil that's been sucked down into there directly into that tile and deposited. And this is soil loss that we don't account for in any of our equations. But that 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot is about a ton of soil. So thinking about these, that aging infrastructure of our tile, repairing, replacing those, fixing those so they don't get larger, all important. All right, talked a little bit about the 4 R's, right, rate, source, place, and time, trying to take those into consideration. Strategically, when we're planning that system, we want to have those soil tests, those good soil tests, only apply if needed. You Using variable rate technology to only apply it when it's needed. If possible, apply it as a starter. You know, it's less of it is lost if we're injecting it below the ground. Also, if runoff potential is high, then only applying 1 year of phosphorus if possible. I know sometimes we're putting on 2 or 3 years worth of phosphorus. We'll put it on after the soybean crop for the corn, and we're putting it on for 2 years. But if we're putting it on for 2 years, we also have higher potential for loss. So just trying to think about that. I still think there's some potential with strip till again to especially this injection in the fall, placing that phosphorus below the soil surface. You know, less of it's lost. We're not just applying it on the surface, especially on a soil that has high runoff potential. If we haven't gotten a good you know, soil health going with that, aggregate stability and all that. So trying to do what we can with that. Again, we think about those 4 R's as a great starting point, controlling all those various forms of erosion, sheet and rill and gullies, irrigation induced, again, the tile blowholes, tile suck holes, different parts of the state, wind erosion also moves nutrients. Kind of think that's a contributing factor in the Western Lake Erie Basin. You know, we remove all these fence rows, and that soil particle bouncing along the ground has to fall out someplace, and oftentimes the only place it has to fall out is in the open ditch. You know, it goes just to the edge of the open ditch. You know, maybe during the winter time, you know, you see some of that dirty snow, that snart. Then that snow melts on the edge of that open ditch, and now we've moved, you know, nutrients across there, moved soil and nutrients across there, and deposit them directly in the ditch, place we don't want them. Also thinking about the runoff, that water management, doing what we can to protect that, to impact that. So there's phosphorus restrictions, particularly related to livestock operations, doing what we can with setbacks and buffers. All important in this whole scheme of things. As a reminder, doing what we can to build soil health. Want to make sure that we're doing what we can to get that water to infiltrate where it lands, or reducing that erosion. And then those other practices will come into play. Again, this is what we spend a lot of time talking about. Building those systems, helping them work better together, and how we think about this related to phosphorus. Again, I'll emphasize that strip till part where we're trying to get that nutrient below the soil surface, in contact with the soil. I've heard numerous times, lots of times, that when they want to get that phosphorus in contact with the soil, advocating for incorporation. And as we incorporate that, we just, you know, we have increased potential for erosion, but in most cases, we're not doing what we can for soil health. And I think we've got to think about this from a system standpoint, not from an individual pollution delivery standpoint. We've got to think about all this. Another piece of this is those continuous living roots, doing what we can to include those, trying to get some winter hardy cover crops, trying to tie up that soluble nitrogen and phosphorus, or adding a cash crop, winter cash crop to the rotation. Talk a little bit about these practices for managing runoff and control. Again, I'm going to emphasize this again. Taking those areas of field that are less productive out of production. You know, if you've got a 20, just do the math, sit down and do the math sometime. 20-acre field, you've got a 1 acre part that drowns out or is erosive, and, you know, say it drowns out, it gives you 0 production, but if they've gone ahead and fertilized and planted it, you know, if the whole field, the 20 acres averaged 155 bushels, 160 bushels, and you take that one spot out, you increase the average yield by about 10 bushels per acre. There's little that a farmer can do to increase their yield by 10 bushels per acre. There's little else they can do. Taking that one spot out of production that got them a 0 is one of those things. And oftentimes those are environmentally sensitive. They're a low spot in a field. Sorry. I just think we need to think about that one more. We have some potential to target some of those. Practices for managing tile drain and water quality. Again, drainage water management, controlled drainage, nutrient interception, wetlands, two-stage ditches, ability to use those as well. So as probably the favorite part of the presentation, the conclusion slide, phosphorus and water quality. You know, phosphorus is an essential nutrient for healthy plants and animals. Phosphorus is often limiting nutrient in fresh water and can promote algal blooms. It's the nitrogen that equals the harmful algal blooms. The amounts of phosphorus for crop production are often several orders of magnitude higher than the desired water quality concentrations. We've got a lot of phosphorus out there in the environment. It doesn't take very much of that phosphorus, dissolved phosphorus, to impact our water quality in a negative way. So how do we reduce some of that's there? Those high soil test levels can increase phosphorus losses from farm fields. Can move absorbed particles of solute, such as with tile drainage water. How do we impact that and reduce those losses as well? And how do we pull all those pieces together and again, think about that in a conservation planning implementation standpoint. I know as we develop these and think about these from a programmatic standpoint, but you know, depending on our water body and if sediment or nitrogen or phosphorus is more of an issue, trying to identify those first pieces, but trying to pull all that together. And I still think do what we can to get the water to infiltrate and land where it lands at. I'll take my chances what comes out the tile in most cases, but you know, if we've improved that soil health, in many cases we will improve the water quality. We have other practices we can utilize when that's not the case. So with that, I should have had a slide that had my contact information. You probably know how to get a hold of me if you have questions. Grace and or Shannon, any other questions or last comments?
There are some questions in the chat that popped up.
Okay, well.
The first one, this one kind of got lost in the class questions you answered or you asked earlier, but is there any data to suggest that the U.S. might have enough livestock manure to meet all the phosphorus needs of the U.S. grain crop without mining phosphorus?
Well, that's a good question. Is there enough phosphorus in the manure to meet all the crop needs? I haven't seen that specifically answered recently. There was some work done, Kellogg and some others, I think in the 90s, that tried to look at that, and in most cases that was not the case. I think we have potential of moving it around more, but and even with the soil test phosphorus that's here and other manure, there was not enough. But if you think about it, you know, if we apply manure to 10% of the acres currently, and if we'll say 3% or 5% of those acres of that total, there didn't need to be any more manure applied to. Now, if we applied it to more, you know, all of a sudden we are able to spread it out where it is. Mostly phosphorus is not a limiting factor, you know, but if we could get it spread out, it'd be very beneficial. Good question. I don't, from what I remember, what I've seen, there is not enough phosphorus from manure to meet our crop needs.
And then Another one is, you stated that soil health farmers were reporting greater nitrogen use efficiency. Are soil health farmers also reporting greater phosphorus efficiency and or less need for applied phosphorus?
Good question. Another good question. I have not heard the soil health farmers mention phosphorus specifically, and that'd be one of those probably in the back of my mind things I'd love to ask them specifically. I think if you take a farmer like Rick Clark, if you've gone to some of his presentations, he has greatly reduced his nutrient inputs, and I think he's applying, wow, this is from memory, a little to no additional fertilizer, phosphorus or potassium inputs right now. But again, his is a very mature system and has the biology going there. And so this is a concern that we've had is as we get a more mature system like that, oftentimes we don't see, we'll hear farmers that have, soil health farmers that have very low soil test phosphorus levels, very low. That would show that they would need extra phosphorus nutrient applied, but they don't apply much or don't apply crop removal rates, and we don't see that phosphorus is deficient there. So I think there's going to be more coming out on that here soon. Unfortunately, we're hearing more of it anecdotally from our farmers than what's been replicated and are reported by researchers.
Hey, Tony, can I add to that?
Certainly.
This is Shannon. So yeah, great question, Andrew. From what we actually hear, if Tony's right, that what our soil health farmers see is the soil test phosphorus levels are not necessarily increasing, but they are not applying as much phosphorus and not seeing any impact on yield. And I'll just ask a rhetorical question, and why might that be? And what we think is going on is the mycorrhizal fungi, one of our key biological pieces to our functioning soil health systems is increasing. And as we know, mycorrhizal fungi have the ability to associate with plants and provide nutrients to those plants in exchange for sugars. And one of those key nutrients that they're able to extract is phosphorus, which is typically tied up and not even measured in a soil test. But we think that that's what's going on. And so again, farmers are not seeing yield drags without even applying phosphorus according to what our tri-state fertilizer guide might say may be needed. So again, anecdotal, but definitely a huge benefit to our soil health farmers that a lot of guys are seeing out there.
Thanks, Shannon. Good points. Another one I'll add to that is that we'll also have less runoff. So if we have less runoff, we probably have less erosion carrying phosphorus with it, or less runoff too. We have less of those loss mechanisms. So what percent of our phosphorus was applied was being lost. It might not be very much, but still there's a little bit there. So all that kind of combines and adds up. So good question. Good thought process. Thanks.
Another one was, someone asked where the Indiana ORI is available.
Indiana Offsite Risk Index, and as I'm looking at the slide, it's terrible. I put the presentation together, look at the slide, as I actually refer to it as a nutrient and sediment transportation risk assessment tool. It's in section 4, Field Office Tech Guide, under 590 nutrient management. There's a publication there that has that and references that. It's some pages long, a little more detailed descriptions about all of that, but then also it's included within the Purdue's Manure Management Planner. And if someone has questions or trouble finding it, especially someone outside of our, let me know and I can send you the site or the link or the resource publication.
And then the last one was, what do you mean by limiting nutrient and fresh water? What does it limit? Yeah,
that's a good question. that's always been worded awkwardly to me. I think it refers to the nutrient that is missing. You know, that when you have enough of it or abundance of it, that then it causes the algal blooms. I'm guessing that's what they're referring to. So when you don't have enough of when you have an overabundance of the phosphorus, then it produces algal blooms. So I guess it's limiting in that factor that you don't have it and now you do, and it's a problem. So I agree, it's worded awkwardly. Sorry, I didn't do better with that one.
Then that looks like that was all the questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Grace. Appreciate that. And any last comments from Shannon?
Nope, I'm cool. Great job.
All right, thanks. So got done a little bit early. So like we said, we'll submit these names in. It'll get added. Aguilar, don't expect it to happen today or tomorrow or whatever, but give us a little bit of time to get that done. But we've captured the names and we'll get that submitted. So if not, no other questions, I think we can end now. If you have other questions related to this, you saw some slides that you wanted or you want for another presentation or something, let me know, and we can get those to you as well. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll sign off. Have a good day.